Good evening, everyone. I'm Alison Hobbs, convener of the Environment Action Interest Group of CFUW Ottawa. Welcome to the third and final webinar in our three-part April series, Tackling the Environmental Crisis, Together We Can. As we approach Earth Day on Friday, April 22nd, we're learning about ways in which each of us can help to solve today's enormous environmental problems. Together we can. We're making the recordings available on YouTube so that a wider audience may be inspired by the speakers we have invited and introduced. This webinar series was planned jointly by the Nepean, Kanata, and Ottawa clubs of CFUW. CFUW is a national, non-partisan, self-funded organization working since 1919 to improve the status of women and to promote human rights, public education, social justice, and peace. There are CFUW clubs in every province across Canada. We want to acknowledge that our three local clubs are located on the never surrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And as environmentalists, we also recognize that these Indigenous peoples lived in harmony with their natural environment for thousands of years without damaging it. We have so much to learn from them. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Seth Klein, joining us from Vancouver. Seth is Director of Strategy for the David Suzuki Institute's Climate Emergency Unit, launched last year. Before that, he served for 22 years as British Columbia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a social justice think tank. In fact, Seth has been a social activist for the past 4 decades, initially in the peace and anti-racism movements. He writes regularly for the National Observer, and he recently wrote this book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, in response to a special report of 2018 by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. One reader of Seth's book, Mary Jane Philp of Kingston, was so impressed by it that she bought 338 copies, sending 1 copy to each MP in the Canadian Parliament, along with a cover note saying, "You must read this." What was her motivation for such an extraordinary gesture? She had just recently become a grandparent. David Suzuki too has urged everyone to read Seth's book so as to realize that giving up is not an option and can't be done is not an excuse. In response to the climate emergency, fundamental systemic change is needed, and at high speed too. But Seth reminds us that Canadians have done such a thing before in times of crisis, and he believes we can do it again. So to explain all this, let me hand over to the author himself. And as you listen, if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A, and Seth will answer as many of these as we have time for. He also has a surprise for us, a bonus guest he would like to introduce, another important member of the Climate Emergency Unit, who has come along to tell us about a new campaign we should support. So over to you, Seth, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good evening, everyone, or if you are on the West Coast like I am, it's still afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction, and my thanks to CFUW for this invitation. I've spoken to CFUW events a number of times over the years to local chapters. This is the first time I've spoken to such a large group of you. I appreciate the invite and thank you all for your interest and for making time. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. And for my talk, I'm going to be drawing upon the book that Alison just showed you that came out about 1.5 years ago, A Good War, mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. I've been asked to speak for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to introduce you to another member of our team at the Climate Emergency Unit, our Ontario organizer, who's going to take a couple of minutes to share things that those of you in Ontario can do to get involved in this task of our lives. And then we should have lots of time for Q&A, and I'm looking forward to that. So this past year, I think has really been one of our reckoning with the climate emergency, especially in my home province of British Columbia. You know, first it was the extreme heat dome event in June that shattered temperature records and robbed us of almost 600 British Columbians in less than a week. That's about a quarter as many as died from COVID in our province in the entire pandemic. And I want to drive home this point. That June heat dome event was the most deadly weather event in Canadian history. I don't believe we have properly gotten our heads around the scope of what happened. And most of those who perished were isolated lower income seniors, and it was preventable. If their homes had already been unplugged from gas and converted to electric heat pump systems, which also cool in the summer, as we urgently need to do to lower our greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings, it's very likely that every one of those people would still be with us. That was followed by hundreds of wildfires and forcing the evacuation of thousands of people from their homes, most dramatically burning the entire historic town of Lytton to the ground in our province. Elsewhere in the country, it was flooding and drought. More recently, in November, it was these mudslides and flooding caused by rolling atmospheric rivers. There's another new word for our climate crisis lexicon that drowned over 600,000 farm animals, again, forced thousands from their homes, inflicted incredible damage to numerous communities around the province, caused billions of dollars in damage, both to personal property and to vital public infrastructure. So I think many of us are wrestling with growing feelings of grief and anxiety as we witness these unfolding disasters, as we emerge from one crisis and stumble into the next. It seems like we're at this awkward place where we mobilize to put fires out, but not to prevent them. We respond to floods, but we don't prevent them. And there's this tendency, you know, often when these events get described in the media, they get described as the new normal. They're not the new normal, I'm afraid, but in fact, a taste of things to come. If you thought the last 2 years of pandemic living were disruptive, I'm afraid you haven't seen anything yet, if we don't get serious about the climate crisis. Because as disruptive as COVID was, at no time, at least in Canada, did it upend our food and water systems the way the climate crisis now is and will. And as anxiety producing as the pandemic was, it didn't have the same physical effects that extreme heat does. You know, you remember in the early months of the pandemic, when we all gathered outside our homes at 7 o'clock and banged pots and pans, you know, most of us became our best selves. But extreme heat messes with our brains and with our capacity to cope just when we most need to call upon our best selves. And then starting in August and more recently, we had these 3 updated reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This is nearly 300 of the world's top climate scientists offering up yet another terrifying reminder that we are on borrowed time. And in the language they use, but especially if you follow this in the news and you listen to the language that the UN Secretary General used in describing these reports, for the world's top diplomat, he's using language that is very undiplomatic. He's referring to these reports as an atlas of human suffering, but he is in particular calling on governments and saying that they have been engaged in a criminal abdication of leadership. And he has said to world governments that they are making commitments and then they are lying being his word. And that in continuing to invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure, he is calling that ethical madness. So make no mistake, folks, we indeed confront an emergency. That's what these IPCC reports are saying. This is the defining civilizational threat of our time. And if we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the coming decades, things get very grim, especially for those of you who are grandparents and parents for the next generations that are coming. But what I mean by very grim is a world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, quite possibly ungovernable. So it's an ecological crisis, but I want to emphasize this point. It's just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. But that is the last of the scary news that you're going to hear from me tonight. Instead, for all of you feeling like me, deeply anxious, I want to offer up two reflections from my study of emergencies. So my book study of the Second World War, our shared experience of this pandemic, and this period of climate emergency. I want to offer two observations that I think offer a little hope or solace. The first is this: all emergencies start with a period of denial. All emergencies start with a period of denial. But then my second observation is that at some point, some sort of alchemy occurs, a special combination of events and leadership that shifts the popular zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. And once that happens, these emergencies, once they're recognized, transform us. They transform our society, our social relations, our economy, and our leaders. Think about Canada on the brink of World War II. Both the public and our leadership were in fact in denial. And even once Canada declared war in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that, even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary. And even once they declared war, historian Jack Granatstein refers to the first period as one where the Canadian government wanted to prosecute what he called the limited liability war. Historians will refer to the first 9 months of the war as the phony war. And it strikes me that if you had asked Canadians in 1938, say, a year before, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy, as was about to happen? I'm pretty certain most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang. And they had no reason to believe otherwise. But then that alchemy of events and leadership, events like the fall of France, but also leadership that moved and shifted the public. And then, fast forward to the pandemic. Remember at the early months of the pandemic or weeks when we first started to hear about this new virus a little over 2 years ago, we were all in denial, weren't we, about how it was about to upend our lives. And then that alchemy of events and leadership. I don't know what events you remember. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. Now, I don't even watch basketball, but I remember when that happened. I remember thinking, wow, this is different. But also, I know that seeing our prime minister giving those briefings in front of his house every morning, that also signaled something major. And like those Canadians in 1938, if you had asked me just a few months earlier, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada capable of quickly pivoting in the space of weeks and creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? I hate to say it, but I would have said, no, there's no one home there who thinks that way. And it turns out I would have been wrong. But then we come to the climate emergency. And at some level, we're all almost in some state of denial, right? Not yet ready to leap into this grand transition. That's certainly true of our political and business leaders. They're still in denial. And what I mean by denial is they're not in denial about the reality of human-induced climate change, but rather they're in denial about what confronting it actually requires. But it's not just them, it's all of us, right? We're all making our these futile little bargains with the laws of nature, right? Please, just a little more time with this vehicle, or one more trip, or please, just a few more barrels of oil, or my favorite these days, please just let us have this last pipeline and we'll use the money to fund the transition. The alchemy's first ingredient, the transformative events, those are already happening. That's what these extreme weather events are. But the alchemy's second ingredient, the leadership, isn't there yet, but it's coming. Most of us know the battle of our lives must soon get underway, and most of our leaders in government and industry are now talking tough on climate, but in deeds, they're not yet there. So I hope and believe that my book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. The book endeavors to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, but I have been heartened and gratified that for the most part, people are finding the book unusually hopeful, notwithstanding the dire subject matter. The original twist of the book, as the title suggests and as has been alluded to, is that the book is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. Now, there is, by the way, no small irony in me coming to this framework that I'm invoking here. And I want to acknowledge that, like many of you, I suspect, I also wrestle with this war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. Moreover, I am a child of Vietnam War resistors. That is, in fact, how I happen to be Canadian. But despite that personal history, I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and to galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And why do we need a new approach? Because what we've been doing isn't working. I want to screen share a slide here. There you go. So what you see in that slide are Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years. I haven't updated this with the latest data, which does show a small drop in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, when everything was in lockdown. But there's lots of concern that in 2021, we don't have that data yet, it'll go right back up. And this slide includes a little hat tip to Greta Thunberg, whose apt description of climate policies and promises to date is so much blah, blah, blah. But let this chart sink in, because what you basically see over this 20-year period is a flat line, right? Our GHG emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions plateaued at an historic high. To put this in the language we now all know from the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. We are not on a path to stave off an horrific future for our kids and future generations and our nieces and nephews. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes. And now we're staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we urgently need to do and what our politics seems willing or capable of entertaining. And somehow we have to kickstart something new. So I didn't actually start off planning to write a war story. My book project began as an exploration of how do we tackle that gap? How do we align our politics and economy in Canada on the one hand with what the science says we urgently need to do to address the climate emergency? Now, the book does do that. But in the original book outline, there was only going to be a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd long been intrigued by the war story as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around those lessons. Because I see in the history of our wartime experience this helpful and in fact hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we actually retooled the entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so the book explores what wartime scale emergency mobilization could actually look like. And each chapter kind of jumps back and forth in time. Landing on this World War II structure, it gave me a good narrative hook for the book. It also jolted my thinking about emergencies. I've worked on the climate file for 20 years, but it made me look at that material through fresh eyes, through the lens of emergency. And I think this historic excavation kind of liberates our imagination, our sense of possibility, because in many ways, the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism isn't just, this privatization and tax cuts and spending cuts and all of this, but the most insidious legacy is the sapping of our imagination and our sense of possibility and our collective faith and our capacity to undertake great things together. That's what I was trying to excavate from that World War II story. What I didn't anticipate until being out in the world with the book the last year and a half is how remarkably and deeply resonant this 80-year-old story remains for so many Canadians, either because they have a connection to the World War II story, a family connection, or they're an institutional connection. And I get to make a little mischief with all these audiences, whether I'm talking to audiences of business people or labor people or architects or journalists or farmers. I mean, they've all got a connection to this story. And I pull bits from the story to say to them, these people who did something remarkable during a previous existential threat, who you admire. Well, here we are again. And who do you want to be? Ever since releasing the book, every time I do an interview or a talk like this, invariably people want to know, okay, but how do you know when a government actually gets the emergency, when they're actually in emergency mode? And in seeking to answer that question, it forced me to distill this 400-page book into what I now call the 6 markers of emergency. And they are the framework that we now employ with the Climate Emergency Unit. And so I'm going to share with you what these 6 markers of emergency mode are, and I'm going to quickly walk you through them, and that'll be the bulk of the talk. They were written for governments, with governments in mind, federal and provincial, but really, as I show them to you, think about how they actually apply to any large institution, a crown corporation, a union, a pension fund, a faith institution, a post-secondary institution. So here are the 6 markers. All right, I think you're seeing them now. So how do you know when an institution or a government is in emergency mode? Number 1, it spends what it takes to win. Number 2, it creates new economic institutions to actually get the job done. Number 3, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. Number 4, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. Number 5, it leaves no one behind. And this is about the connection between inequality and taking action in the face of an emergency in order to achieve the social solidarity that is necessary to mobilize a society. And number 6, it centers Indigenous leadership and rights and title. So those are the 6 markers of emergency. During the Second World War, the Canadian government certainly did the first 4 big time. And in response to the pandemic, I would say, at least in the first year, the federal government hit all 4 markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far at least, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe hits any of those markers. So I want to explore them with you, okay? Marker number 1, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. In the first year of the pandemic, the government's really spent, the federal government really spent, and Canada's debt to GDP ratio went from about 30% to 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year, but it still pales in comparison to what happened in the Second World War, where we ended the war with a debt to GDP ratio well over 100%, more than double that. And when C.D. Howe, who was the minister who oversaw Canada's wartime military production, was pressed about this extraordinary ramp up in government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance that war effort, the government issued public victory bonds and also new forms of progressive taxation on upper income Canadians, on corporations, including, by the way, a cap on profits. The kind of profiteering that we have seen in the pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. I could tell you, if you're interested in Q&A, how they structured that. But if anything, the extraordinary public spending we saw in the first year of the pandemic really, for me, laid bare what could have been done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out when our governments recognize an emergency, the money's always there. And while the federal government now likes to talk about how much money they're spending in the face of the climate emergency, it still pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic response. Consider this, that whole first year of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the CERB and the wage subsidy and all those emergency measures to the tune of about $5 billion a week. In contrast, Trudeau government spending on the climate emergency clocks in at about 7 or 8 billion a year, right? There's the contrast. Marker number 3, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where we struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships, again, from a base of virtually nothing. And remarkably, the government, in order to expedite all of this production, created 28 crown corporations during the war in order to get this done. A lot of that overseen by this guy, C.D. Howe, who was remarkable in his way, in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't do what he needed done, he created another crown corporation. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort, right? The Trudeau government has established, I believe, 2 new crown corporations during its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I hate to tell you what the other one is. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation, the one that is to build, where we all become the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline that we're to expand from Alberta to my province. If our governments really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and geothermal facilities and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we would see a new generation of public corporations to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. Marker 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. When I showed you earlier that flat line of emissions, why has there been so little progress? I think a big reason is that if you survey federal and provincial climate policies to date, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. We give tax rebates. But what we have decidedly not done is require change. So if we're going to meet these greenhouse gas targets that we urgently need to hit, we're going to have to set dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would say you'll no longer be allowed to buy a new fossil fuel burning vehicle as of 2025. Or we would mandate that no new buildings will be permitted to tie into natural gas lines as of next year. Or we would ban the advertising of fossil fuel vehicles and gas stations, right? That's how we would make clear that this is serious. Marker number 4, that relates to marker number 4, which is tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. It took leadership to mobilize the public in World War II. See, in frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were both forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector keen to rally the public. We all witnessed this kind of emergency communication in the pandemic, didn't we? Where the messages are ubiquitous. You get daily press briefings. You hear regularly from public health officials. The media took seriously its duty to give us necessary information on a daily basis. None of this consistency and coherence is there, though, with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure like they just did 2 weeks ago by approving this new Baie du Nord project offshore off Newfoundland, they are effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. Marker 5, leave no one behind. You know, sometimes you hear from these climate policy experts who say, you know, don't link the climate fight to tackling inequality or all these social justice issues. Don't make this any more complicated than it already is. Don't weigh it down. I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong, first of all, because the issues are connected in many ways. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But we also need to link these things because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender. The public has to have confidence that sacrifices are being made regardless of income. During the First World War, inequality and really kind of grotesque profiteering undermined social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment. And so consequently, at the outset of the Second World War, the King government took these bold steps to lessen inequality and limit excess profits. We saw these new progressive taxes implemented. We saw Canada's first major income transfer programs, unemployment insurance. Even though we were spending like crazy on the war, unemployment insurance came in the war. The family allowance came in during the war. This famous Marsh report, this major report that lays the architecture for the whole post-war welfare system, is written during the war and is offered up to the Canadian public as a pledge and a promise that the society they will come back to would be more just and more fair than the one they were leaving behind. That's when we got the cross-society mobilization. That's when we hit the recruitment numbers. And my point in recalling all of this, as we face today's threat and the need for mobilization, is really twofold. First, to appreciate how inequality serves as a barrier to mobilization, but second, to understand that effective mobilization isn't merely about producing more planes or tanks or today wind turbines and solar panels. It requires those policies that fulfill a promise that we will better look after one another and guarantee good jobs and income supports to people as we make this transition. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how we get everyone on the bus. That's why there's so much appeal for the Green New Deal. And there's an historic echo there that is captured in the polling. When you link the fight again on climate with tackling bold measures to tackle inequality, the support for the bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. And the final lesson is around Indigenous leadership and rights and title. And I want to illustrate this point with a story about a World War II vet. One morning when I was writing in 2019, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne, near where some of you are. You know, interestingly, much like it had been important for the Canadian government to independently declare war separate from Britain in 1939, interestingly, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Oakes died at the age of 94. The code talkers were these Indigenous soldiers tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among the Allied forces. And when news reports came out about Oakes's death, his daughter revealed that astonishingly, Oakes hadn't told his own family what he did during the war for 7 decades, having been sworn to secrecy. Only in his late 80s, when stories of the code talkers were made public, did he finally reveal what he had done. And then he got a Congressional Silver Medal and special honors from the Assembly of First Nations and the House of Commons in Canada. Oakes was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of others from Indigenous nations across North America. As the war was unfolding and these secret codes employed by the Allies kept getting broken by the Nazi and Japanese forces, but then the US Marines discovered that enemy forces were unable to crack Navajo. And ultimately, 33 Indigenous languages were used by various branches of the Allied forces, including from a number of Indigenous nations in Canada, including the Mohawk language and Cree and Tlingit and Ojibwe. But as I learned about this, it struck me that there is in this piece of wartime history a tragic irony. Our two countries, Canada and the US, have spent generations trying to erase Indigenous languages from the earth, literally beating them out of children in residential schools, only to discover that they were the unbreakable code. That's what they were dubbed in the war, credited as having been vital to certain victories, particularly in the Pacific. And then as we fast forward to today, I think the same can be said about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent climate action over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous rights and title that is buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics come into compliance with the climate science. Final thought. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world we're leaving my kids and many of yours and those who will live out through most of this century. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to rise to the challenge in time. But consider this. In the Second World War, from a population at the time of about 11 million Canadians, over 1 million of them enlisted. That's remarkable, eh? But you know what all those people didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. I think we often forget there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how their story ended, but they didn't. And yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving, not just on the battlefront, but on the home front too. I think that's the spirit that we need today. And with that, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Saba Ibrahim. Saba is a biologist and has worked around the world doing work in that area, but is now in Ontario, like most of you. And we're thrilled that she, a couple of months ago, agreed to join our team as our Ontario organizer. And I want to invite her to say a few words, specifically for those of you in Ontario, about how you can get involved in this mobilization. Over to you, Saba.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Saba Ibrahim, and I organize Ontario for the climate emergency. It's really exciting for me to do this work and to organize visionary leaders and organizations because I'm a fairly recent immigrant to Canada, and where I used to live before moving here, the work I'm doing now would be illegal. I never take for granted being able to do this, and I know how powerful it can be. It wouldn't have been illegal if the people in power didn't know very well what it could achieve. So in Ontario, leading up to the election, we've had organizations coming together organically to create the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. And the campaign is centered on a 10-point action plan for the government of Ontario that lays out exactly what needs to be done to combat the climate emergency. And being part of the campaign means making a commitment to holding the government accountable to those very necessary actions. Now, the campaign hasn't even officially launched yet, and it already has over 100 organizations signed on. And that represents over 100,000 Ontarians, and more signatories are joining every day. So personally, I don't think there's anything in the world that's more powerful than groups of people who seem superficially quite different coming together with the strength of a shared conviction and speaking with one voice. And that's the kind of power that's needed to get us through the climate emergency. And the organizations that are coming together for this campaign are incredibly diverse. We're welcoming faith leaders and their congregations, educators and their unions, labor groups, anyone who wants to make sure that Ontario takes the climate emergency seriously and is ready to throw their weight behind making sure that happens. And we're particularly interested in sectors that are already on the front lines of leading Canada through the climate crisis. So youth, labor, educators, first responders, healthcare workers, people in the arts and culture sector, food and farming, but really anyone. Because we're at a tipping point and this issue affects everyone. So every single one of us has a role to play and has the power to do something. And people like you are so perfectly positioned for this moment. You're well connected, you're organized, and we know your being here and listening to me is a testament to it, that you're ready to act. And your help is going to make this campaign successful. And it's not money that the campaign needs, not now anyway. It's the voices you can bring to this chorus. So I'd like you to take a moment, like right now, think of organizations that you are connected to, that you are involved in, who would be interested in supporting like this. And you'll be getting the link to the campaign shortly, and that includes a list of the current signatories. I'd like you to take a look at that list. Think about who's missing. What blanks are you seeing on that list that you could help fill in? And when this event's over, go to those organizations, show them the campaign, take it to your congregation, take it to your community group. And if you're not part of an organization, or honestly, even if you are, but you want to take that next step further, take it to your candidate. And, reach out to me. My email is sabah@climateemergencyunit.ca. If you have questions, if you need help, if you need support, if you're excited about the possibilities, you want to bounce ideas off of someone, I would be more than happy to talk to you. Your association, your organization wants someone to tell them more about this, give me a call, drop me an email. Happy to help. And I think the last point I'm going to make is this campaign is great and it's exciting and I'm thrilled to share it with you, but it's also a prelude. We're building up to the election. We're building power by doing this work. And that's going to go beyond the election. We're leading up to everything that we're going to do beyond that. So let's do something great together. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sabah. And I should say that I just learned before this meeting that the CFUW National and Ontario have signed on, which is just fantastic news. But like Sabah said, you'll get a follow-up email after the event with the link to the page with all the other signatories, and like Sabah says, see who's missing. And that would be great.
Thank you very much, Sabah. Thanks also to Seth. I've got some interesting questions here, and so perhaps we can go on to the questions. There are a few about climate denialism. How do you respond to the recent American statistic that 30% of the population do not believe there's a climate crisis? Somebody says, I don't want to be negative or Cassandra, but how can we realistically hope to beat the industrial lobby and not leave anyone behind if the anti-vaxxers movement and the convoy, truckers convoy, show that part of our society is comfortable in totally denying scientific evidence? A war has a visible enemy. Climate change is incredibly entangled in our society, and the big polluters are also the big employers. And somebody else says, how do we deal with the fake news contingent, which is growing?
Excellent questions. So first of all, when it comes to out and out climate denial, it's true that it's a bigger problem in the United States, but we're in Canada, and here's some good news. When you actually look at the public opinion polls in Canada, I want to make the argument that sort of straight up climate denial isn't actually our main problem. What the Canadian polling shows is that it represents really a diminishing rump of public opinion, about 7%, which is why the argument that I make is that the bigger barrier we face is what I call the new climate denialism, which is to say our political leaders who say they get and accept the climate science, but don't practice an agenda that aligns with what that science says we have to do. That is I think, our bigger problem and the one that we need to tackle. The point about the convoy and so on, I guess the point I would make is this: no mobilization ever achieves unanimity. We didn't have it in World War II, especially at the beginning. We clearly didn't have it in the pandemic, as the convoy illustrates. And we don't have it and won't have it on climate, but neither do we need it. And as discouraging as it was to see that particular anti-social manifestation of the convoy, it really is a minority opinion. Like, in the main, the majority of Canadians supported COVID mandates and continue to, and in fact did before our politics, right? My recollection of how things unfolded was it was the public ahead of our politics saying, bring in the mandates. And there's an interesting similarity with the war. At the beginning of the war, the governments in Canada, the United States, Britain were very nervous about the idea that they would have to bring in rationing. They thought they would encounter a kind of popular revolt. Didn't happen. Turned out that rationing was one of the most popular things that they did, because that was both a way that everyone could do their bit, and also that they could know that it was unfolding in a fair manner, impacting the rich as well as the poor. And I think that a similar dynamic is true when it comes to climate. On all of these things, what the polling tells us is that the majority of us want to do the right thing. We want to do right by our neighbors and fellow citizens. But it irks us that we would do the right thing and our neighbors won't, and will undo all of our good work. This is the value of mandates, actually, is that it liberates us from that. You don't need to worry about your neighbor. Your neighbor's going to have to come along too. And so you're always going to get an anti-social reaction to it, but in the main, the public supports it.
Change the subject slightly. How do you think the war in Ukraine will affect the climate of the world?
Oh, that is a complicated one too. I mean, first of all, wars are always destructive to the environment and climate. And there is this connection to the fact that fossil fuels are fueling this war. I mean, the Putin regime is making $1 billion a day on its sales of fossil fuels to Europe. And it has been Russia's key export and source of export earnings for decades. The prosecution of this invasion would not have been possible without fossil fuels. But on the flip side, like the examples I told you about World War II and the pandemic, the war has this invasion and the response to it also again serves as this reminder of how quickly we're capable of moving, right? Look at the response from the government. Now we're working with our allies. We're banning Russian imports. We're freezing the assets of the oligarchs. All of these things where we used to wring our hands and say, oh, it's not possible. Turns out we can do it, and we can do it super fast. I also think that we are seeing a leaping forward in Europe of how quickly they want to now get off of their reliance on Russian oil and gas. And that in some ways, this may expedite the transition off fossil fuels in a way that would not have previously been the case. So it's a double-edged sword, is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. So this may be a question for Saba, a question about the nuclear laboratories in Chalk River. I don't know whether you feel this is relevant to the subject, but somebody says here the borrowed time is ticking very loudly now. What is your position on the leadership regarding the nuclear waste? And if the dump leaks, there will be a civilizational threat, as this questioner puts it, all along the Ottawa River and beyond. What can we do?
Mm-hmm. Saba, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to?
You can lead off, Seth, if you want, and I can.
I don't have great expertise on Chalk River specifically. I mean, there's the nuclear piece is another World War II legacy. But the nuclear question comes up a lot on climate, right? Because it has serious environmental impacts and environmental risks, but it's not a fossil fuel. It's not producing greenhouse gas emissions. And so where does nuclear figure into all of this? I'm of the view that where we have existing capacity, we probably don't want to phase it out super quickly. We're going to need it for a time anyway. But when it comes, there are certainly some people who say we actually need new nuclear capacity, including these so-called small modular reactors as part of the climate response. I am not sold on that. To invoke a line, again, I'm everyone's word uncle, the way I always go back to the war. To invoke a line from the war that Mackenzie King used in the conscription referendum, he said, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. That's kind of how I feel about nuclear. I haven't seen the evidence that we need it. And in particular, everything now is about speed and scale. Nuclear doesn't lend itself to speed and scale. It's so expensive. It faces so many regulatory hurdles that it doesn't lend itself compared to wind and solar and other renewables that are so quickly scalable and so much less expensive. My feeling is we should focus on those.
I think all that I would add to that is a line from this question, because I'm reading it in the chat right now, jumps out. What's your position on the criminal abdication of leadership regarding deadly and nuclear waste? And I would almost end that sentence 4 words in. And I think, I'm sure Seth will agree with me, criminal abdication of leadership on any pressing environmental issue is unacceptable. That's a no-brainer. In the sense of what can we do about denial, I will be the first to admit that I'm not an expert on nuclear, but it needs to be combated in the same way that all forms of environmental denialism are combated. And that means slowly chipping away at it with people that you know and with the people who are encompassed within your sphere of influence. If you're asking what you in particular can do, if that's the we that's represented in your question, that would be my answer.
So in general, how do we advocate more effectively to get leaders to take bold actions? And how do we get the leaders to see beyond their usual 4-year policy horizon from election to election and focus more on the long-term challenges?
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge in the awkward period that we're in, right? And it's why, it's important that Saba was here making this pitch. There's all of the things that we need to do individually in our lives to change how we get around and change how we heat our homes. But the path to victory is a collective and political one. Somehow we have to shift our leaders into emergency mode. And, those of you in Ontario are looking at an election where this is about signaling the importance of this issue to you as a voter, to all of the candidates before you, that this is a priority item, and signaling to them in different ways that you are ready and willing to see a level of boldness and ambition that we have not seen. I would say all of our leaders are a bit trapped in these neoliberal assumptions about what is and isn't allowed. So in some ways, we're wanting to tap into what they did in the pandemic to say, look, you got that emergency. Look how quickly you moved. But this is the next civilizational threat. It is the challenge. There are differences between climate and the other emergencies I spoke to, in particular that climate moves in slower motion. And that's allowed our political leaders to kind of kick the can down the road. And this came up in the first question. I think I failed to answer it. It has an active lobby from the fossil fuel sector blocking and slowing progress at every turn. And for those of you in Ontario, why aren't we getting gas out of our buildings? Well, because Enbridge is doing every nefarious thing in their power to block that from happening. And we need to recognize it. We need to name it. And we need to be saying to our politicians, you too should name it and confront it and stop trying to appease and seek the favor of these companies that are slowing progress.
I think the only thing I would add to that, apologies for interrupting, Seth, is
No,
from
no,
an
go.
organizer's point of view, we keep talking about power. I mentioned it a few times in my talk earlier. And it feels like a sort of nebulous concept if you aren't familiar with how power works. And I'm not here to deliver a lecture on that. All I'm going to say is that leaders tend to pay attention to expressions of power that can't be ignored. Those come from institutions. Institutions are built by individuals. And that's sort of my job as an organizer and the job of many people who are already doing this work. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get these voices who are all saying the same thing to unify that message so it's coming from one megaphone versus a lot of people talking in a room, if that analogy makes sense.
And it's why the letter that Saba was talking about and that you'll get in your follow-up email, you know, there's a place for individuals to lend their voice to this, but in particular, we're trying to get large organizations like yours, like CFUW, to sign on. That is a signal to political leaders that's much harder to ignore.
Well, I'm glad to say we have signed on, and unfortunately we're running out of time. I'm looking at the clock here, and I do need to thank everybody. So thank you so much, Saba, for urging us to support and raise the awareness of these things you're speaking of, and we have indeed signed on. So thank you, Seth, for writing your book and for making time in your very full schedule to meet us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for responding to the questions. I'm afraid there are many good questions that we hadn't time to ask you, but they will be kept on file. And
can I say one final thing, Alison, that
sure.
kind of harkens back to an earlier question? I made all of these similarities with the pandemic, but I want to mention one thing that's different. And it relates to that question about mandates and the convoy. The things that we have been called upon to do in the last 2 years in response to the COVID pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. You know, stay home, isolate, mask up. And that's hard. It's been hard. The good news when it comes to the climate emergency is that the things we are called upon to do now are precisely the opposite, to go out and do something grand together. And I think we can do that for a few years.
That's great. You're leaving us with encouraging thoughts, as you said, hope and solace. And by the way, all of our speakers' books can be obtained from our local independent booksellers. We'll be sending the links to these books after the webinars. It's a good idea to support the small businesses. So this evening, I'm afraid, wraps up our webinar series, and I must not fail to express our gratitude to the people who've contributed to this project. Our guests of honor in particular, we had Rebecca Prince-Ruiz for the first webinar, Diana Beresford-Kruger and Bill Steer for the second, and now Seth and Saba. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Councillor Teresa Kavanagh, MPP Joel Harden, whose name happens to be mentioned in Seth's book, by the way, and CFUW Ontario Council. And I should personally like to thank Marcia Armstrong, the president of CFUW Nepean, who has chaired our planning committee so ably since last fall. Marcia has been leading from the front. The hardworking members of our committee all deserve appreciation too. I think we agree this was a job worth doing. Thanks also, we appreciate the many people who have supported us by attending these webinars. On these Wednesday evenings, we've been passively taking in what the speakers had to say, and now it is up to each one of us to respond in a more active way by passing on what we have learned and by making step-by-step changes in our own lives for the sake of a better world. One of the slides showed a slogan saying, "The climate is changing, so should we." Christiana Figueroa is architect of the historic 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change Mitigation, has spoken often of the need for stubborn optimism. I would also like to quote the words of the historian Howard Zinn. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. To live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. And that reminds me of something Aaron de Hoog of Wetlands International told us when he met CFUW Ottawa's Environment Action Group in February. He said, hope is an act of courage. So let's remember all these things, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good night now. Good night.